Yep, yep.
You're lucky. And then we also have the students that are away can only hear you if you're staying close to that little black box right there.
Okay.
So if you stay around that area.
Stay around the box.
This conference will now be recorded.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming in today. I'm happy to present to you Dr. Frank Spinelli, who will be talking about clinical trial design today. So feel free to quickly grab the food if you haven't done that yet, but we're going to get started.
Great. Thank you. All right. Since most of you are rising second years, you probably don't know who I am. As a background, I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Education. I'm also the Chief Medical Officer for Clinical Research over at our Palmetto Health USC Medical Group, and I'm also a staff physician at the VA here. My background and training is I went to graduate school first, a little unusual, got my PhD. Then I went and returned to medical school at MUSC. That's an okay medical school, it's okay. Then completed my training in cardiac surgery and joined the cardiac surgery faculty at MUSC for quite a number of years. And the motivation for coming here was what is unfolding now along a number of healthcare systems, which is reconstruction and merging and developing a comprehensive health system. And that one now, which we are part of, is called Prisma Health. And Prisma Health now, of course, encompasses two medical schools, the USC Medical School here and the USC Medical School in Greenville, and a large number of hospital systems to be the largest healthcare provider in South Carolina. And I saw those clouds coming, and I thought it was a really exciting opportunity. And moreover, this medical school is in a great opportunity for change. There's a lot of curriculum revisions that are going on. And of course, new innovations such as the one we're participating in today with Dr. Chris Turley and the Research Center for Transforming Health. We're very early on in my training, particularly that in cardiac surgery. We were really testing and developing innovative ideas on a regular basis. And so it was woven into the fabric of our practice to perform evidence-based studies and to be constantly reviewing best practices. I would put forward to you that we've gotten a little lackadaisical on that. I'll also share with you the fact that I was at the FDA last week. And I was in front of the FDA. There was 14 of them, including the director for the Center for Drug Development and Evaluation. And I will tell you that if you rely on the FDA to be certain that everything is safe and effective in your practice going forward, you are misguided. They are like any other government agency. They are trying to do their best, but that does not absolve you from responsibility in careful and critical evaluation of the drugs and therapies that you offer your patients. And so the idea here today is, as part of your ongoing seminar series, is not to make you experts and clinical trialists, but hopefully start to make you a little bit more aware of some of the nuts and bolts that are really essential in the construction of a good, strong clinical research study that you can read and accept some of the evidence that they put in front of you. Fair enough? You're not, most of you won't be doing research as part of your practice, but you certainly will be doing evaluation of evidence and best practices constantly and forever. And so that will require you to do something which is called reading. And I put in front of you today what is usually for patients in the Midlands their source of medical information, which is the state newspaper. And the state newspaper has a number of scientific breakthroughs and discoveries and treatments for patients. In fact, about every other day they have one in there. This is an example. And I'll close out with one that appeared Monday as a take-home exercise. Okay. So for me to advance this, I just use the arrow key here. How about this one?
Didn't work last time.
Sorry about that. They went to sleep? All right. So for those of you that are listening remotely, and we're recording this, obviously, we'll also provide this as a PDF file for you to go review at your leisure. But we're going to try to just go over why evidence-based clinical trials are an essential part of medicine, identify the different clinical trial types, just go over a little bit of basic nomenclature that you'll see, which includes intention to treat, interim analysis, and what a data and safety and monitoring committee is. I am not going to overload you with a high amount of technical material. In fact, I'm going to start with an entertaining story. How about that? Okay. So here's a word. Anybody heard this word before? Yeah, charlatanism. It was used a lot in the early part of the 19th and 20th century for medicine practitioners, and they were called charlatans. Also, a lot of magicians and those that would perform magic acts could sometimes be called charlatans. And basically, it is a fancy word for perhaps phony, but also it is someone who has a good knowledge of material and a vocabulary, and then tries to use that to sell you something and to sell an idea. Well, let me go ahead and put a face on charlatanism for you. Here you go. This guy's name was John R. Brinkley, and I am not making up one word about the horrifying story you are about to hear. He attended Bennett Eclectic Medical College in 1908 through 1910. I use the word attended. And by the way, this is when medical colleges could pop up anywhere, everywhere, and were unregulated. In 1913, he established the Greenville Electromedic Doctors in Greenville, South Carolina, in 1913, and offered a revitalizer, colored water injection, which he performed in the gluteus maximus for $25 in 1913. So basically, this was colored, non-sterile water. And you do not do injection of water, doctors, any time. Thank you. Basically, he obviously had a number of abscesses, ulcerations, pain, probably infections and death. And so by 1914, the citizens of Greenville, South Carolina, ran him out in a rail. Well, John R. Brinkley was not to be denied. And this is where the concept of charlatanism, this is the concept of what you see in the state newspaper as of today, which is there's a nubbin of scientific fact that is interwoven in the story. And this is when, in the early 1920s, endocrinology was being found. The idea that there is these circulating substances that affect organ systems far away from where they're generated. And it was really becoming recognized that there had to be something going on in the male nether regions that it was important to male wellness. And these gonads were recognized as important for male sexual performance and related to prostate health. That's absolutely true. In fact, people and farmers back then would comment, I don't know, we're in a fairly rural area of South Carolina, so if you ever want to venture out, take a look at a male goat, you'll get the idea why they might use the word Randy as a billy goat. And this particular theme and concept is going to come horribly together in just a moment. John R. Brinkley offered rejuvenation surgery. That was the idea that you must have gonadal dysfunction, and therefore these large gonadal anatomical structures in a male goat must be the answer. So you would go, you would pick out your goat, he would then resect out the goat testicle and implant it in the scrotal sac of male patients. The cost was, again, brilliant. We use the term today. The first thing that some institutions and hospitals, especially for-profit hospital systems, will do, what do? They biopsy your wallet. Well, that's what Mr. Brinkley was doing. He would see how much you could afford, and that would be the cost of this surgery. And for 1920, $2,000 was a lot of money. And these guys would line up. It's estimated, I think this is an underestimate, because there were so many that were embarrassed after this whole thing was exposed that they did not admit that they underwent surgery. There's rumors that the Vice President of the United States was in line for this at the time. But conservatively, 16,000 of these procedures were performed. All right, it gets horrifyingly worse. So here is a picture of John R. Brinkley. Remember, he attended eclectic medical school for 2 years of questionable performance. At the head of the table is Mrs. Minnie Brinkley, who practiced dropping anesthesia for 25 minutes prior to the first case. She is now a qualified anesthetist for these surgical procedures. I can only imagine if you were not completely comatose and were having your resection done, what that must have felt like. Anyway, so there's Minnie Brinkley performing ether anesthesia, because that was the form of anesthesia that was available at the time. Extremely dangerous, very volatile, very difficult to manage. And the surgeon of the day himself, John R. Brinkley, posing and showing how they are ready to go. What else did he do? He franchised it. Like any brilliant business guy, he brought in and charged other questionable doctors to do this procedure. He then charged a franchise fee, and they all spread out across the country performing this procedure. Again, we really are not sure how many of those he actually performed. Well, I want to make some notable points about what this guy was. He was a genius in terms of marketing and direct patient advertising, something that we may want to revisit when we get done. He made mass media campaigns. He would bulk mail. He would have direct-to-consumer targeting. He had radio stations. Back at the time, radio was a huge deal, and he actually had a talk show where you could call in, and he would have this medical question box where you could submit your questions, and he actually had, the Brinkley Formula number 3 for what you needed. And he had set up a whole bunch of drugstores, Brinkley Pharmaceutical Association, where a vast majority of these compounds contained mercury, they contained lead, and they contain all these other lovely substances for your ailment. He developed a really neat strategy. He put up these very high power output radio towers right at the Mexican border. So he was not subjected to any of the early fledgling FCC regulations or any federal regulations. So he could just blast this stuff across into the United States, virtually unregulated and totally free from any particular control. As I said before, he developed the Pharmaceutical Association. He also was a master of going back, and if someone was in fulminant sepsis, tetanus, dead, he would deal with the family individually and take care of it. He would then develop, as I said before, very strong political connections and a lobby group in Washington, D.C. Does any of this sound hauntingly familiar to today? This is just a small snippet. It doesn't broadcast very well, but there's examples of this in libraries across the country where this is a mailing of a slideshow showing poor old Pop on the left walking on a cane, and Grandma's all frustrated. She's getting no love. And then we have down at the bottom right where Grandpa is just, miraculously rejuvenated and looks like a 20-year-old. He also did something remarkable. If this was today, it certainly would be blast emails, robocalls, all this type of stuff. This guy invented direct patient advertising. And what he had was a fleet of trucks with these giant megaphone speakers on. And he would be in the back with his paid hawkers, and they would drive through town saying, and you know who he was reaching out to? Was he reaching out to the male patients that were having prostate trouble? No. He was directly advertising to the women. Is your husband not happy? Is he having problems? And this is literally some of the script that this guy would have in these trucks. Pretty good, huh? I'm telling you, he was a genius. Evil genius, but he was a genius. Well, there was this a real medical trained physician up in Chicago that was looking in and following this stuff. And his name was Fishbein. And I won't go into it. This is a fascinating story, but this is how the American Medical Association was founded. This particular incident is what started to propel a real professional organization that was then starting to go out and questioning some of the medical practices and expecting and analyzing actual data and outcomes. This was the beginning of it. And it was, he began an editorial campaign where he went out and he actually started to survey families that would talk to him, and he went, holy moly. And he started to debunk the theory of rejuvenation. And I keep bringing up this rejuvenation. Is that spelled right? It might be. Rejuvenation because, we use a different word today, don't we? For stem cells and all that. What's it called? Regenerative medicine. Anyway, so he reported on the deaths and morbidity. Here's a picture of the guy that really is the outcome following the scrotal gonadal transplant and the poor goat, both of them getting mutilated. There are a large number of reports now starting to circulate that the outcomes of this were not what they were proposed to be. Interestingly, John Brinkley sued Fishbein and the fledgling American Medical Association for defamation. And it went to court where Brinkley was the one that was pushing the case forward. The judge listened to all the evidence, listened to some of the patients, and then coined the term, Mr. Brinkley, you're a quack. And that's where that came from. And that this was all quackery. But following that, everything started to unravel. Lawsuits against Brinkley snowballed, and he actually died of a massive myocardial infarction in 1942. Just a little final snippet. Minnie Brinkley, remember her? Well, she kept running those big, powerful radio stations across the border right there in Texas. And a couple of very young guitar players with some long beards came in. And Minnie goes, okay, fellows, you can play on this radio station. And that was how ZZ Top started to make it to fame. And when Minnie Brinkley died in 1978, ZZ Top actually wrote a song that hit the top 10 charts to Minnie Brinkley. Isn't that weird? Isn't that something? So again, every bit of that is scaringly true. So, charlatanism. That's an interesting history story, Spinelli. I mean, what has that got to do with us here at medical school in 2019? I've just finished my lunch and now I'm getting bored. Okay. We don't have charlatanism today, do we? Oh, absolutely not. This is one of my favorite guys because, he is also a trained cardiac surgeon. But he went to the dark side. And so if you listen to some of his show, isn't it something? Because every pitch he makes, what's in there? There's a nubbin of medicine and scientific fact. He does provide some great education in what he talks about, atherosclerosis, fibrotic liver disease. It's true. It's what comes after that, not so much. So we really need, for evidence-based, properly designed, and powered clinical trials more than ever. So let's talk about what those are. They have an unfortunate numbering because it can get very confusing. But a phase 1 trial, which is what I was appearing before the FDA for, is the very first in man clinical trial. A phase 1 trial is not to establish efficacy. And a lot of times they will, companies and a lot of charlatans will try to leverage some phase 1 stuff to say, hey, this is safe and effective and ready to go. No. A phase 1 trial, its primary purpose is to demonstrate feasibility, that you can do it in patients under the disease context that you're proposing, and that it is safe. That's it. It is not powered to be able to show the outcome. And what I mean by powered, we'll get to in a minute, but it's the sample size. For example, the phase 1 trial that I'm proposing in front of the FDA, and I think they're going to let me do it, is going to be a whopping sample size, ready, of 10. So it is there to establish feasibility and safety. A phase 2 trial, that's where the rubber hits the road. A phase 2 trials are usually of substantial size, and it is to test whether or not the intervention changes a very specific outcome. And a phase 2 trial, the most important thing when you read these, the outcome and the change in that outcome must be pre-specified. A lot of times when the study is complete, we will do a secondary analysis and we'll go, oh, look, this drug prevented cavities, when the initial drug outcome was supposed to be a drop in A1C levels for diabetes. Can't do that. Nope. But that is what we call secondary or post hoc analysis. Not fair. The indication of a phase 2 trial, when you read one, is they better have right up front the pre-specified primary response variable, and I'm going to show you an example here in a minute, is all-cause death, all-cause mortality. That's fine. But you can't change that at the end or in the middle or anywhere else, okay? Phase 3 trials is when you really start to push this out into the real world, where you start to expand this into a large and more diverse patient population. Unfortunately, phase 2 trials tend not to be as diverse a patient population. We're getting better. But this is when a phase 3 study is really pushing it out there. We've established that the primary outcome is good, the drug is effective. Okay, now we're going to really move it out for long-term use. The company's got their clearance, and you're going to be following these patients for longer term, and watching a lot of what might be adverse events that you wouldn't have picked up in a phase 2 trial. Phase 4, these are where you're really doing more of how effective can we penetrate the market? Can we label this with a prettier labeling? This is where a lot of issues come in with respect to a conflict of interest, where this is where the pharmaceutical reps will be out and really trying to change brand marketing, and it's more of like getting more of a foothold and a presence in the market. What drives the phase 2 trial primarily is the statistical power. Now, this is not a statistics course, right? But statistical power, from my limited understanding, has got to do with when you're balancing the risk of 2 types of errors that you can make. And first is called the type 2. Have you guys heard about this stuff? Am I repeating something you've gotten in, I think, your introduction to clinical medicine? Okay. Well, the real biggie and the statistical power is premised on the type 2 error, which is the failure to identify a difference when one exists. My goodness. If you're Novartis and you're going to launch this phase 2 study, it's going to be horrifically expensive. The last thing you want to do is not recruit enough patients into the study where you can demonstrate that your drug has made a change, right? And on the other hand, you certainly don't want to overshoot like thousands upon thousands of patients that you don't need when you can already demonstrate a difference with a smaller sample size. So a lot of work and a lot of thought and a lot of conjecture and a lot of risk, and I've seen some biostatisticians fired from Novartis because they messed it up, is the statistical power. So when you're reading a well-designed phase 2 trial, there's likely to be a big section on how they came up with the sample size and the power analysis that drove the final size determinations of the study, okay? If that's missing, I would be nervous. The intention to treat is simply that. Everybody that comes into the study gets randomized to a particular treatment, and after that, you don't remove them from the study. That is not a bad thing to do. A lot of clinical trialists get nervous because that can dilute your statistical power because you're going to lose some patients to follow-up. They just disappear. They decide, you know what, doc, I don't want to do this experimental drug anymore. Okay, they withdraw. There seems to be a patient having an unexpected adverse event, and you suspect it may be the study drug, then the physician can actively remove a patient from a study. And all of those patients, though, are still counted in the analysis. The optimal design, the one that I would love to see you read and look at with respect to the things we talked about, right? Identifying the primary response variable ahead of time, has statistical power written up very carefully, and then they use the nomenclature, randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blind trial. That's a lot of words, but they all have a very high impact hit meaning. Randomized. That means every patient is brought to a spot and they are unbiasedly, as much as they can be, randomly put into a treatment group. The placebo means you have the proper control. This can be very, very difficult in some of the work that I do with respect to cardiac devices. You don't want to put in a placebo device in someone, which is cut them open and put a big can in there that's empty. So the placebo-controlled part for that can be a little tricky. But what you really are after here is if you want a comparator group that's receiving optimal standard of care. And that's a discussion for another day because we're shooting well below that mark all the time anyway. But in clinical trials, all those patients that are randomized to the non-active treatment group are going to receive the ultimate standard of care that's available for this disease at the time. That's the goal. So the placebo is just to make sure that all these patients are as up to and are being fairly compared to whatever that active treatment might be. The other thing is double blind means the patient doesn't know and you don't know. And that it's a coordinating center somewhere else. And they're just giving you a number, and the drug vials come in the FedEx, and that's it. You have no idea. And the beauty of that is I have seen it because I've served on the Data Safety Monitoring Board. In some particular clinical trials, the physicians at the local participating centers usually call in. They're really worried about adverse events, and 70% of the time, it's someone in the placebo group. It's really interesting. And so it's really valuable to have a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial where all the biasness in a lot of the inherent things that can happen at a local level are removed. And finally, of course, the pre-specified outcome and effect estimate is made ahead of time. Okay, so those are real important things to be looking for in a valuable and appropriately designed trial. It looks so good. There's a lot of terms that you'll see. The number needed to treat, which is basically how many would I have to treat to be able to see an effect. The control event rate, I'm going to show you an example of that. And then the absolute risk reduction. These are words you'll hear. I wouldn't worry about these too much right now, but these are some of the terminology that they'll throw at you, but they all come back to the same thing. How many patients do you have to treat to see the effect, and have you clearly identified what the specific response variable is and what the relative risk reduction you've achieved is all about? So let's give a very brief example and then we'll close out. This is a compound that I worked on very early in my career. At the time, the company was called Ciba-Geigy. They were then taken over a little tiny town in Basel, Switzerland. By the way, it is the size of Columbia, maybe that big, all right? And it's tucked in right at the border of the Rhine River between France and Germany and Switzerland. And King Louis, I don't know what number, threw out all the alchemists from France in the 1400s. Because at that time, the bishops and the priests said they were all practicing witch doctors and sorcerers and were the devil. And so all the alchemists from France, who were quite well educated, knew lots of stuff about early chemistry and herbs and stuff like that, jumped in little boats. And they ended up in Basel, because right below Basel, if you ever go there and see the Rhine River, there is some scary waterfalls that happen right after that. And they went, oop, this is good. And that is really what founded a lot of our modern-day pharmaceutical sciences was in this little town. And it's got Hoffmann and Roche. This is the capital of Novartis, and many other drug companies are right there. And I worked with them very early on to develop a molecule that would do two things. And you'll learn a lot more about this in pharmacology, but I'm sure you've heard of the angiotensin-converting enzyme. All right, the angiotensin II receptor. Okay, so this is a drug that had a very potent angiotensin II receptor blocker in it, and also inhibited an enzyme called neprilysin, a neutral endopeptidase. And one of the endopeptidases that you probably have heard of is natriuretic peptide, ANP, BNP. So there was a lot of thought of that if we put these two together, this would be a blockbuster combination single pill thing. It's not like we're super gluing these together. This is actually one molecule that does both things. And we worked on this thing forever. I don't want to, but if you're interested in how this drug works some more, we do have a paper that came out in JAMA not too long ago. About this whole thing, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we did. So this was a very large, double-blind, prospective trial where we were looking at this angiotensin receptor blocker and neutral endopeptidase inhibitor, and we were comparing it to what the standard of care would be for patients with heart failure. And the bottom line is, we said, you know what? What do we care about? We don't want to care about their cardiac function. We don't care about their ejection fraction. We don't care about their blood pressure. What do we care about? Do they die? And do they come into the hospital more? And if we don't hit that mark, who cares? So the study was designed on what we call a composite cardiovascular endpoint, which is all mortality as well as cardiovascular-related hospitalizations. And we compared it to this drug as to a pretty standard ACE inhibitor that you would use in patients with heart failure. This is what the structure of this study looked like, which is not unusual for a lot of drug studies, particularly ones where you are bringing in a new class of agents. And that is, you've got to do a run-in period to make sure that the patients will tolerate the dosing that you're providing. And this is not done in a double-blind way. This is done where the physician is watching you carefully as you up-titrate the experimental compound. We want to make sure that this is a pretty potent angiotensin receptor blocker. This is a pretty potent neutral endopeptidase inhibitor. So we're doing all kinds of things with your blood pressure, right? And so what we want to make sure is these patients don't stand up and go boom. And so you would do orthostatic blood pressure tests. You would do lots of things to make sure that they were hemodynamically stable prior to running them into the study. So once they got, you could tell that everybody would tolerate this well, then you would randomize them, and some would stay on that active treatment, and others would be withdrawn to just the ACE inhibitor group. And this is the randomization scheme, and this is the double-blind period, because now I don't know which side of the treatment arm you're on. And in this particular study, the plan was to follow these patients for 5 years. So look at these numbers. 10,500 patients were screened at a little over 1,000 centers in 47 countries. A lot of these patients just didn't fit the criteria for heart failure, and some were randomized, and a bunch of sites didn't know what they were doing. Believe me, there are a lot of clinical trial sites that don't quite meet the snuff, and they were randomizing patients. They didn't know what they were doing. Anyway, a total of 8,400 patients made it through the interim run-in period and then were randomized. Look at the size of these. These are 4,000 patients randomized to the two arms here. You think Novartis went all in? I got, as you'll see in the JAMA paper, I got news for you. We're still not sure how this works. And yet they went all in. A little spooky. Anyway, the median follow-up period was 27 months, and there's a reason for that. By approximately 2 years, the all-composite event rate, death and hospitalization, was starting to develop a trajectory that was much lower in the LCZ group than in the standard of care. And this is where a group steps in, which is called the Data Safety and Monitoring Board. And what their job is also not only to look at adverse events and make sure they're not rolling up inappropriately in an active drug treatment, and they're going, okay, hold it. And I've got a definition for them in a minute just to be sure you understand. But they are also charged with, is it unethical to continue the study? And that can be in two ways. First is at that 24 mark, if these two lines were completely the same, they would say, you know what, the probability of you detecting a positive outcome with this trial is extremely low. Therefore, it's unethical to continue. Now, that would be a devastating blow to a drug company, but they would also probably like to know, you know what, we better just fold up and go home. The second is, if they're starting to emerge a very positive outcome, you don't want to continue patients on the other treatment arm if you see that there's a substantial difference going on. And so in this particular case, this study was planned to go for 5 years, and it was stopped at approximately 3.5. And that's because there was a substantial reduction. And you know, you're looking at that going, spinality, that's a substantial reduction. In my world, it is. In my world, it is. And this would be a very similar type of survival curve you might achieve with a new cancer chemotherapeutic. You're not going to win by that blue line being down there, just in cancer survival. Give me a few. Give me something, and we just continue to build from there. And that's what indeed this particular study showed. We were all enthusiastic about this p-value, which, by the way, when you see a p-value that is 0.0001, that's enough. The 0.00001, the guy that did this milk packer he's a very good cardiologist, but he's also a professional comedian. He really loved the P0002, and he made a whole little ditty about that. Anyway, this drug is now called Entresto. And I'm pleased and proud to be part of it. I'm still a little worried when I turn on the TV at night how they're pushing it. So there is some things to be aware of. This is only for a certain form of heart failure. It's very expensive. And you need to first make sure all your patients are on standard of care heart failure therapy, which many, many are not. But this is a new generation drug that went through the double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, pre-specified outcome, and yielded a positive result. And this is the evidence that you want to decide whether your patients would benefit from the addition of this new medication on top of their heart failure therapy. The interim analysis that was performed here was certainly done and is conducted before all the study participants have completed the study. And that was where the Data Safety Monitoring Board did an interim analysis, and they go, you know what? You don't need to go to 5 years. They are an unbiased group. This is very important. I have served on Data Safety Monitoring Board. I do not talk to any of the active sites. I do not engage with the investigators. There's a firewall between us and the sponsoring company. We are to be an independent entity, and that is really critical. So when you're looking at clinical trials, make sure there's some description in there on the structure of the Data Safety Monitoring Board. Okay? They can't have anything to do with the study. Now, I was put on the Data Safety Monitoring Board because I knew a lot about the pharmacology of this drug, and I was not actively engaged as a physician performing the study. Some of my colleagues were, but for almost 2 years, we couldn't talk about this subject at all. Okay, so it's very important that there's clear independence of the Data Safety Monitoring Board. Data Safety Monitoring Committee is the same thing. All right, let's close up. So Monday, June 17th. Here we go. This is what your patients will be reading. The peripheral neuropathy is the biggie now. The pins and needles that diabetics get, oh boy, there is every cream, every pill, every thingy. The chiropractics have this magic light. It's all out there, right there for you to have, right in any strip mall, right out here in Two Notch Road. So what do? You carefully read this thing, and I picked out, I thought, was some beautiful nomenclature. With the conclusion of the Human Clinical Use Survey trial, the makers of whatever this is are offering it nationwide. The Human Clinical Use Survey trial. Do you know what that is? I don't either. But it sounds really good, doesn't it? So you need to be really careful. Remember, go back and look at those definitions of what a clinical trial is and make sure those actual components are in there. And this hardly is it. So what I thought you should do, I think this is really of value, is go and find a direct patient advertising. It could be some, last night I was watching the baseball game, and the father-son, and the father's a physician and a sexual expert, and they're pitching Roman. which is, I don't know exactly what it is, but I have a funny feeling it's a testosterone derivative because it's to fix your sexual performance, balding, cold sores in men. And I'm going, wow, that sounds scary. You see how we haven't really come that far, have we, from John R. Brinkley? But find something and look at it and see if it contains any of the elements and/or violations of clinical trials practice that we talked about today. And take one of these state newspaper articles, one of these direct patient advertising things, and how might you talk to a patient that comes in all excited about it? How would you start the conversation about evidence-based medicine? That's not going to be as easy as you might think. Because remember, they're coming in with hope, and they want you to validate that. So if you go, oh, there, you just lost the patient's trust. So you got to come up with a different vocabulary. And now, of course, wowing them with big fancy words ain't going to work either. But and then finally, pick out just by going to PubMed a nice published peer-reviewed double-blind placebo-controlled trial in any area of medicine that interests you, and take a look and see if you can find those nuts and bolts that we talked about today. Fair enough? All right, guys. I'm real proud of you all for doing this summer research rotation versus going to the beach, and I hope you all enjoy it very much. I can answer any questions, or we can just sit back and ruminate on our lunch. Yes, ma'am.
What is your opinion on the legality of direct patient advertisements?
So it is a very fuzzy area right now, and I don't know if I would use the word legality or the word ethic. And there are two separate things. They're perfectly legal right now. Whatever your political wins are, the president is going to do something that I think is pretty good, which is he's going to force cost of these drugs to be part of the disclosure that goes by like a used car ad at the end. And I think legally we don't have any teeth to stop it. Ethically, I think it's atrocious. And I just think that they really are diminishing and blowing by the very serious discussions that a physician-patient have on the real, true adverse events and side effects. I mean, they just, and it's everything from, watery eyes to you're going to die. And they just run them all out, and it kind of is diminishing the impact that the physician-patient discussion will have later. And because you go, now you understand that there's a very high risk of a rare form of thyroid cancer with a lot of these immunologics that seems to be a strange side effect. And but they go, oh yeah, I heard about that, doc. You see what I mean? And so the ethical part of this is what really disturbs me. I have a funny feeling the FDA is going to start clamping down on this, but the biggest thing to do is to be prepared for your patients to come in and you knowing full well that they've been exposed to that, and be ready for the discussion. Yeah.
Those type of think that, of course, is added into that healthcare cost. Are there billions of dollars that people are spending on some of those supplements? Those supplements are the treatments for Alzheimer's disease, right? To improve your memory, to enhance your eyesight. And think about our aging population that is really worried about their eyesight decreasing. They've got emerging macular degeneration. They forgot their keys. They can't figure out where they park, and now they're. Well, I never get on that memory supplement, even if they're not sure it works. So I don't know what else to do. And they may or may not tell you, but they may also be spending a lot of money on stuff like that, and they may not have a lot of money because a lot of the elderly people on fixed income don't. So you want to really think. I think the comments that Dr. Spinelli was making about how you open the door for people to talk to you about that, and then how you respond to it is really important, because those are one of the things that happens, and I've seen it in my own family as people are aging, is that they sign up for these supplements and they get sent them every month, and they get an automatic charge on their credit card, and here's another month's supply of the memory supplement. They don't even know they're taking it anymore, but they keep getting it, and it is a very expensive activity that you will have patients engaged in that they don't know the benefits, they don't know the risks. There may not be that many risks except for the loss of money, time, and potentially not pursuing things that may have an evidence base that may be meaningful, because they're already taking something for that. They don't even tell you about it. So there's the things that you drive and that you have to know about, and then there's the things that you may never know about that are going on. So it's a very real phenomenon.
Catherine.
So you mentioned the importance of a child not coming to a conclusion that wasn't predetermined. Or whatever. If they do, if the example came to mind of Viagra, they weren't looking for that particular effect, but they found it. It is very expensive, apparently. So, what is the reasonable or legitimate way to go about standardizing, or do you do like a whole other clinical trial?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And a lot of VAs were initially involved in the Viagra study and sildenafil, and it was a blood pressure medicine. It was a blood pressure lowering medicine. And at the VA in Charleston, it was a long time ago, and I'm so embarrassed. I'm old. But I remember the clinical research nurses going into the rooms in the VA where these vets were that were on sildenafil, and to get their blood pressure checked, because that was the big thing, right? You got to get your blood pressure checked, and they would get embarrassed, and they would lay down on their stomachs and hold their arms out like that. I'll leave it to you to figure out why. And that was the observations that were a secondary outcome that were written down over and over and over again. So what had to be done was they would say, okay, it was a terrible blood pressure medicine, but we are going to design a clinical trial for erectile dysfunction in elderly men. And we're going to redesign and do a proper prospective phase 2 trial with that as our indication. And, and so if you do see, it's totally legitimate to repurpose something or identify another indication. The big one is, inflammation. And if you see that there's a potential for a particular drug that is indicated for, gastrointestinal disease, and it looks like it may also be good for plaque psoriasis, that's fine. Redesign a study and push it forward for that indication. And most pharmaceutical companies and most sponsors will do that because that gives them additional life on the patent of their drug and a lot of good things. So there's nothing wrong with making what we call secondary response variables or observing secondary outcomes. But take those and then rebuild the next study for a new indication if that's the case. That was a very good question.
So phase 1, so in the case
Ah, all right. Well, you're very good. Yes, absolutely. Because again, the phase one study, we're not testing a primary response variable. We're not testing an outcome. We're testing safety and tolerability. So if the dosing that was used in the phase one study is identical for your new indication, you skip right over to the phase two study. Absolutely. And that's the advantage of repurposing drugs, which actually is a very big opportunity, something we miss a lot. We're so intent on discovering new molecules, we forget that there are a lot of drugs that have great human clinical exposure data, but that could be repurposed and revisited for a whole other indication. One of those is doxycycline, by the way. We're recognizing all kinds of use for that, and it's cheap, and it's safe, and we're finding that there's unique indications for it. So that could go right to a phase two efficacy study at the blink of an eye. Good question. All right. Yes, ma'am. It's good to see you, by the way.
So I'm thinking, what are the underlying things that we should look for? Because I'm in clinical trials. I think I know the facts when I see them or hear them. But because always I was thinking he's credible. So with what you mentioned, what are the subliminal things that we should be looking out for when you have even somebody credible advertise something or saying something? What are the things that we should be identifying to know whether they're telling us something that is helpful to us or not?
Well, that gets back to if there is the first question you want to ask is there a real, appropriate, designed clinical trial that's been completed that provides the strong evidence to support that whatever it is effective. Second, if there is such a trial, one of the biggest things that happens in a phase two study that we've been talking about is there is a percentage table of adverse events and side effects that are shown for the treated and untreated. And you want to look at those very carefully. An ACE inhibitor, right? An ACE inhibitor, we don't think twice about prescribing an ACE inhibitor for blood pressure, for heart failure, even for sometimes for renal protection, kidney protection. But there's a substantial number of patients that have a side effect that's a cough. And we got to watch out for that. So my suggestion is that you make sure first and foremost that the claims in this treatment has been done on a strong phase two appropriately designed study. And then when you go to the back, sometimes it's in the appendix, but it has to be there, is this adverse effects, side effects table. And you want to look at that because you can see that there may be certain things that are much higher in the active treated group than in the placebo group. And it may be that they are going to be considered by the FDA and everyone else to be acceptable, tolerable adverse events based upon the significance of the primary outcome. Okay? But those are the things that you really want to watch for. Any properly designed clinical trial, phase two clinical trial, will have that type of adverse event table. Wow. All right. Thank you, guys.